This week and next week, we are going to be talking about poetry. Poetry has been around before written language. Most cultures have some form of poetry that is part of their national tradition. The picture is of Orpheus and Eurydice. Orpheus was the pop star of the ancient world. He was reputed to be able to charm wild beasts into submission. His wife died, and so he missed her and decided he would descend into the underworld to retrieve her. Hades, the god of the underworld, after listening to Orpheus play, was moved and said he could take her out of the underworld on one condition, that until she was outside of the underworld, he could not turn around and look at her. Now, as all these stories go, he faithfully followed the directions. Once he was outside the cave that led into the underworld, he turned around to look at his wife. His wife was only at the entrance of the cave, but not outside it. So she was doomed to go back to the underworld. So being a poet does not always work out for your best advantage. So, what will we cover? Understand what poetry is, discuss some of the key terms and concepts, of course, read poetry, help you learn how to write about poetry, and then finally give you some clues on how you might be able to enjoy poetry. So what will we cover? We'll talk about definition, what a poetry is, some of the themes, what poetry writes about, the structure of poetry, meter, sound, imagery, how to read poetry, how to write poetry. We'll do a quick exercise so that you can see how to go about doing your assignments when you have to read poetry. So let's look at the definition of poetry. So what is poetry? So poetry is a type of writing which is characterized by structure, which includes stanzas and rhythm, metaphors, allusions, alliterations. It may include rhymes. Poetry does not need to rhyme, and it's usually written to be heard rather than read silently. Poetry has been around before writing. Because of its repetitive structure, it is easier to remember. Because it was easier to remember, it was used from earliest times to pass on important knowledge. Today we use little rhymes to help us learn various pieces of information. 30 days has September, those kinds of little short poems for memory work. So what is poetry about? Poetry is primarily about language. It is about language and ideas. It's about language and emotions. It's about language and joy, about language and sorrow, about language and love, about language and death. But the most important thing that poetry is about is language and the use of language. Every time you listen to a song, you are listening to poetry. Some songs have moving lyrics, while others are just fluff, talk about nothing really important. But all of them are poetry. This is a recording of Danny Boy, sung by Sinead O'Connor. The poem itself and song has been around for a good 150 years. So, how do you go about reading poetry? The best way to appreciate poetry is to read it aloud. Try following the punctuation. Respect line endings in poetry. Particularly modern poetry does not work so much on punctuation as line endings. Ask yourself why words are chosen, and ask yourself why images are chosen. So let's look at how all of these things can be accomplished. First of all, poetry can be challenging. All poems have some meaning, but the meanings may not be easy to find. Our vocabulary may be difficult. Archaic terms may be used, like thee and thou, the singular form of you, which we got rid of about 150 years ago, and poetic contractions like ne'er, which is short for never. And oftentimes imagery, building up like a picture, replaces stating directly what the poet wants you to understand. So let's look at a poem that has a couple layers of meaning. This is a poem, Hyacinth, by Edna St. Vincent Millay. She was an American poet of the early 20th century. I am in love with him to whom a hyacinth is dearer than I shall ever be dear. On nights when the field mice are abroad, he cannot sleep. He hears their narrow teeth at the bulbs of his hyacinths, but the gnawing at my heart he does not hear. So a quick reading of this poem sort of says that the man that she is interested in is more interested in flowers. However, Hyacinth was a Greek lad who was loved by the god Apollo. When he tragically died, Apollo turned him into a flower, the hyacinth. So Edna St. Vincent Millay knew the myth of Hyacinth, and that Hyacinth was gay. So if you reread the poem, I am in love with him to whom a hyacinth is dearer than I shall ever be dear. On nights when the field mice are abroad, he cannot sleep. He hears their narrow teeth at the bulbs of his hyacinths, but the gnawing at my heart he does not hear. Suddenly the poem takes on a slightly different meaning. It's not that he is more interested in flowers, it's more that he's more interested in men. And therefore, it doesn't matter how much she might like to be involved with him. It is not something that is ever going to happen. And so there is a bit of frustration going on in the poem. So, how are poems constructed? What goes into it? Well, the theme is what the poem is about. Then you want to look at how it is structured, and we'll talk about that. How the poem sounds, the meter, that is the rhythm of the poem. And finally, we'll be looking at imagery, the picture that the poem paints. So what is this theme? What do poems write about? A theme is what the poem is about. It is the meaning of the poem. And it is a theme that sort of unifies the poem. The theme can be directly stated, or it can be implied. Sometimes the theme is to just tell a story, such as in The Raven by Edgar Allan Poe. Other times is to comment on society and life, or to make philosophical observations. If you remember from our first class when we when we discuss what Americans write about. If people experience it or think about it, people can write about it, and the same thing is true with poems. You see the little box up there that says quiz? That's a reminder that this might be on the quiz. So what do poems about? They can be about love and hate, birth or death, solitude or parties. If a human experience, it can be poetry. This is a poem by Dylan Thomas. He was a Welsh poet, which is part of Great Britain. Do not go gently into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. The wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had forked no lightning. They do not go gently into that good night. This is the start of a much longer poem, but this poem is about death, and not to accept it meekly, but to rage against it and protest that you're not ready to go. Fight it. And Dylan Thomas was a boozer and a fighter. Meter is the rhythm of a poem, and this is particularly important in English poetry. So it is the rhythm of the poem that determines the pace of it. And in English poetry is the arrangement of stressed and unstressed syllables. And so this is a poem by Samuel Taylor Coleridge called Kubla Khan. In Xanadu did Kubla Khan a stately pleasure dome decree, where off the sacred river ran, through caverns measureless to man, down to a sunless sea. Notice how the rhythm of the poem moves it along at a steady pace. And poets play with this rhythm of words. There are basically 5 types of rhythms that we find. Many books on poetry will add 2 or 3 more, but these are the 4 basic ones that you will find. Iambic, anapest, trochee, and dactyl and spondee. And iambic and anapest, they're opposites each other, as are trochee and dactyls. So they are both related. So if you look at iambs, which are very common, if you had to take any Shakespeare in high school, you were always told that he wrote an iambic pentameter. And so it basically is a weak sound against a strong sound, as in the word decide. A trochee is just the opposite. It is a strong sound followed by a weak stress, as in window, where the main word is on wind. Oh. And then you have the spondee, which are 2 strong or stressed words next to each other, such as in the word racetrack. Then you have 3-syllable ones, the anapest, which has 2 weak ones and a strong one, as in the word 17, and the dactyl, which is the opposite of it, which starts with a strong and then 2 weak ones, as in the word capital. Now, poets don't always use 2- and 3-syllable words, but certain words by their very nature are less stressed, like the words ah and the and of. And words by their nature are stronger, like tree and rock and love and hope and running and driving. Those are stronger words. So these basic units are put together in an order that make a metric line. So you have a certain number of these and you put them together. So this is To a Wild Honeysuckle by Philip Freneau, an American poet of the early 19th century, 1820, 1830s. Fair flower that dost so comely grow, hid in this silent, dull retreat, untouched thy honeyed blossoms blow, unseen thy little branches greet. No roving foot shall crush thee here, no busy hand provoke a tear. So if you look at the first line, you have fair flower. So you have, it starts with this Bandi, two stressed words. That dust. Dust is an archaic word for does. So that does so comely grow. And so the li at the end of comely is unstressed. And so you can see how those lines are made up. So a metric line is a unit of poetry from where the line starts to where the poem and the line ends. Traditional poetry, this usually is a piece of punctuation, a comma, semicolon, or a period. More modern poetry, the pause occurs at the end of each line. So you have something like roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you. And so at the end of each line, you have a piece of punctuation. And when we write about poetry, we don't necessarily have to put it in stanza form. We use the forward slash, which is called a virgule, to separate. Roses are red, violets are blue, and therefore the reader knows that you have moved on to the next line of the poem. Now, poets use meter to avoid monotony. If you've ever had a dripping faucet, the same rhythm can be rather maddening. So poets vary the rhythm, although there will be a general overall rhythm of the poem. Modern poetry will use rhythm or meter, but seldom will use a fixed line. Older poetry has a fixed line where you have a certain number of those little units of chihuahuas and large dogs. This poem is by Robert Herrick. He lived in 17th century England just after the time of Shakespeare. When as in silks my Julia goes, then, methinks, how sweetly flows the liquefaction of her clothes. Next, when I cast mine eyes and see that brave vibration each way free, oh, how that glittering taketh me. And so he's talking about his lady and how her clothes move as she walks. So liquefaction is another word for liquid. Line and stanza. So we take the meter and we put them into lines and stanzas. So a stanza is a collection of lines. It's sort of like a paragraph in a poem. And many times in older poems it will determine the rhyme scheme. So in this poem by William Wordsworth Longfellow, you're going to read next week or this week some of his work. And the night shall be filled with music, and the cares that infest the day shall fold their tents like the Arabs, and as silently steal away. And so the next stanza will carry on with a new idea. Now there are two types of stanzas. There are the fixed stanzas where it is predetermined how many lines are in that stanza. The one that we read is a fixed stanza. It has 4 lines. More modern poetry will vary it. Some of the Walt Whitman that you will read and Emily Dickinson have variable stanza lengths as well. So be it. I am a wholeness I'll never know. Maybe that's the best. And so that one is not rhymed, and it has different meters for each of the lines. Now, some of the most common kinds of fixed stanzas, and again, there's probably a dozen that are recognized. I'm only going to do those that you will run across in your readings or hear talked about. And they are the couplet, which is 2 lines, quatrain, which is 4, the ottava rima, which is 8 lines, the sonnet, which is 14 lines, and a refrain, which is a line repeated at the end of each stanza. A lot of songs have refrains in it. So a couplet has 2 lines that rhyme and may be part of a larger stanza. So this is by John Greenleaf Whittier, an 19th century American poet. Blessings on thee, little man, barefoot boy with cheeks of tan, with thy turned-up pantaloons and thy merry whistled tunes. Yeah, really exciting stuff. Pantaloons are basically pants, or shorter pants that come a little bit below the knee. But you can see that he rhymes it, man and tan, then loons and tunes. And why did he use pantaloons instead of pants? Because he needed a word to rhyme with tunes. Yeah, sometimes it's as practical as that, where the words that a poet may use. The quatrain is the most common that you will find in English poetry, and it's 4 lines to a stanza. And again, the Longfellow one is a quatrain, and you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. The ottava rima is 8 lines to a stanza, and it's from Italian, meaning 8. So, woodman, spare that tree, touch not a single bough, and youth it sheltered me, and I'll protect it now. 'Twas my forefather's hand that placed it near the cot. There, woodsman, let it stand. Thy axe shall harm it not. He was a 19th century American poet, and again, you could think of this as a very early example of ecological poetry, not wanting a tree chopped down because of its sentimental value. The sonnet is probably the most common form of poems that you may run across. Every poet tries his or her hand at writing sonnet. Some do it better than others. There are basically 2 types of sonnets, the Italian or Petrarchan. Petrarch was an Italian poet of the 1300s, and it consists of 8-line stanzas, or an ottava rima, and a 6-line stanza. The Elizabethan or Shakespearean sonnet has 3 quatrains and 1 couplet. So let's look at an example of an Italian sonnet. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why, I have forgotten, and what arms have lain under my head till morning. But the rain is full of ghosts tonight, that tap and sigh upon the glass and listen for reply. And my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will return to me at midnight with a cry. So that's the 8 stanzas for the first part. And so the second part changes a little bit from the topic of the first, but it is related to it. Thus in winter stands the lonely tree, nor knows what birds have vanished one by one, yet knows its boughs more silent than before. I cannot say what loves have come and gone. I only know that summer sang in me a little while, that in me sings no more. Okay, so what is this poem about? Well, the first 8 lines talk about the men that she has slept with. What lips my lips have kissed, and where and why I have forgotten. So this was a while back. Upon the glass and listen for, and in my heart there stirs a quiet pain for unremembered lads that not again will turn to me at midnight with a cry. So they are not going to return to her bed. And at midnight with a cry, probably a cry of orgasm. The second part is about herself. So the first part is about the men who are no longer available to her. Thus in winter stands the lonely tree. Now, the image of the tree is her. Nor knows what birds have vanished one by one. So these men that she has loved, maybe briefly, have vanished one by one, yet knows its vows more silent than before. And it's not like these relationships were just for a good time. They were more personal and intimate to her. Because she says, I have known that summer sang in me a little while. So their presence in their life was important. And that in me sing no more. And she misses them. Now, this poem was written shortly after World War I. And many of the men that she may have slept with went off to war and died. And so this is a sort of a lament for those people that died in battle that will no longer have a part in her life. The Elizabethan sonnet, again, has 4 quatrains. And then we'll end with a couplet. And so this is the first quatrain, and this is by Shakespeare. Shall I compare thee to a summer day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do not shake the darling buds, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot thy heaven shines, and often in his gold complexion dimmed, and ever fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe and or eye can see, so long livest this, and this gives life to thee. So again, when you look at poems, always pay attention to the beginning of the poem and the end of the poem. So he starts off, shall I compare thee to a summer day? And he immediately says, thou art more lovely and temperate. And he goes on to explain why. Well, summer days have rough winds. Summer is short. It goes away. It doesn't last too long. Sometimes it's too hot. Sometimes it's too cloudy. And nature changes. Some days are nice days, some days are bad days. But you are better than that. By that eternal summer shall not fade. So the person he is describing is beyond summer because it will not change. And why won't it change? And the reason for that is in the couplet at the very end, right here. So long as men breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. As long as people read this poem, you will always be better than a summer day. You will live forever, and you will have immortality. Unfortunately, we don't know who the poem was written for. Sometimes in English poetry, going back to the earliest days of English poetry, when none of you would recognize it if I would to say it. Thas hafarote, this is swameg. That's Old English. There's probably not a word in there you would understand. It basically says that has passed and this will too. But it's marked by stark division in the vision of the line. It's usually indicated by a shift in alliteration. So glory to God for dappled things, for skies a coupled color as brindled, for rose moles all stippled upon trout that swim, fresh fire coals, chestnut falls, finches' wings, landscapes plotted and pieced, fold, fallow, and plough, and all trades, their gear and tackle and trim, all things counter, original, spare, strange. Whatever is fickle, freckled, who knows how, with swift, slow, sweet, sour, adazzle, dim, he fathers forth, whose beauty is past change. Praise him. And this poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins is basically a hymn to the beauty of nature and seeing God in nature. A free verse poem has no set length to the lines or stanzas. This poem by William Carlos Williams has provoked a great deal of debate over what it means. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. That's the whole poem. And so when reading a poem, you don't necessarily have to say, oh, I know this what it means. In this case, just sort of close your eyes and listen to it. So much depends upon a red wheelbarrow glazed with rainwater beside the white chickens. And just sort of imagine it. Remember I said that poetry is about sound and you need to read it out loud? So look at the sound of words and word combination as part of the experience. Poets put a great deal of effort in getting the right sounds. So this is a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April of 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Okay, what he is trying to do in this start of the poem is capture the sound of a horse running. Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere of the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. And so by putting the combination of words and sounds together and the meter, he's trying to recreate some of the idea of a horse running. So what are some of the devices that poets use to create sound? Rhyme is one of them, although it's not required, and much modern poetry does not rhyme. Alliteration, assonance, repetition, and onomatopoeia. Yeah, nice big long word. So let's look at rhyme. Rhyme is frequently used in lines and stanzas together to tie the lines and stanzas together. Some poet forms the last word of one last word of one stanza is the first word rhyming word of the next stanza, so that they are chained rhymes. The rhyme is often used to connect ideas. The rhyme was borrowed from other languages and it's not really native to English. English is not naturally a rhyming language like Spanish is. And we indicate rhyme schemes by small letters A, B, C, D. So in this limerick, this is one of the cleaner ones. There once was a lady from Niger who smiled as she rode on a tiger. They returned from the ride with a lady inside and a smile on the face of the tiger. So you notice that the first, second, and fifth line all rhyme, and the third and fourth line. So what are some rhyming devices that you might see? End rhymes are just that. They come at the end of the line. So if you look at line 2 here and line 4 here, they have the same rhyme, crunch and lunch. And then down here you have question and digestion. You can have internal rhymes so that inside the line you have rhyming words like seed and feed and noodles and poodles. You will also find something particularly in Emily Dickinson, near rhymes that are words that are close in rhyming like water and washer. They're not quite the same, but they are almost the same. And you will have I rhymes. These are visual but not pronounced rhymes. So you have lint and pint. Yes, they look like they should be lint and pint, but it is lint and pint. Alliteration and assonance. Alliteration is a repetition of initial consonant sounds, and assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds. So Edward Arlington Robinson was an American poet of the early 20th century. Friendless and faint, with martyr's steps and slow, faint for the flesh, but the spirit free. Stung by the mob that came to see the show, the master toiled along to Calvary. We jibed him as he went, with houndish glee, till his dimmed eyes for us did overflow. So you notice that the alliteration with the friendless and faint, flesh free, are all alliterations, repetition of the same consonant sounds. The assonance is repetition of the O sounds, and so you have the show, toiled, houndish, overflow. And that gives this part of the poem more of a moaning sound, which also has the O sound in it as a word. A repetition is the repetition of words or phrases for effect. A refrain is a phrase that is repeated at the end of each stanza. Okay, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade. Was there a man's dismayed? Not though the soldier knew some one had blundered. They're not to make reply. They're not to reason why. There is but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. This is a poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson, English poet of the 1900s, commemorating a battle which the soldiers lost, the cavalry, they were on horses, because of some ill-conceived notion of a general. Onomatopoeia is using words that sound like what they describe. Bang, crash are onomatopoeic words. They sound like what they describe. When the frost is on the pumpkin and the fodder's in the shock, you hear the cook and gobble of the strutting turkey cock, and the clacking of the guineas and the clucking of the hens, and the rooster's hallelujah as he tiptoes on the fence. And so you have a number of onomatopoeic words in there that are trying to reproduce the sounds of the animals that he's talking about. Perhaps the most important part of poetry is the use of imagery. And so it is the use of sensual language to convey a concept or emotion. This is a poem by Wendell Berry. He's still alive, an American. When despair grows in me, and I wake in the night at the least sound, in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water, and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things, who do not tax their lives with forethought or grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting for their light. For a time I rest in the grace of the world and am free. So he is talking about, he's getting very concerned about how the world is changing and what kind of world his children will live in. And so he goes off to nature. Like I said, nature is one of those things that is very common in American literature. We saw it in the 1800s, and now we're seeing it in the 2000s. And he builds the image of all these woodland creatures in this wild place by a pond. Metaphor and similes are words that stand for something. A personification is making something that acts human that isn't human, like the skies weep. Well, skies don't have tear ducts, but we take that and make them seem like the one I frequently hear is, my computer doesn't like me. So in Oliver Wendell Holmes, an American poet of the early 1800s, he's comparing the body to a seashell. Build thee more stately mansions, O my soul, as the swift seasons roll. Leave thy low vaulted paths. Let each new temple, nobler than the past, shut thee from the heavens with a dome more vast, till thou art at length art free, leaving thine outgrown shell by life's sun unrest sea. So the chambered nautilus has little chambers. As it grows, it builds more chambers. And so he's using the imagery, the metaphor of that seashell as how to grow as a person, that you leave the past and what you were and you become something more. You're building more stately mansions. Allegory, allusions, archaism, and irony. An allegory is something that stands for something else. An allusion is referencing to something that stands for something else. Archaism is using an old word, and irony is meaning something which is contradictory to what is being said. We run into irony in the story of an hour by Kate Chopin. And this is a poem by Dorothy Parker. She was a 20th century American poetess. A single flower he sent me since we met. All tenderly his messenger he chose, deep-hearted, pure, with scented dew still wet. One perfect rose. I knew the language of the floweret. My fragile leaves, it said, his heart enclose. Love long has taken for his amulet one perfect rose. Why is it no one e'er sent me yet one perfect limousine, do you suppose? Ah, no, it's always just my luck to get one perfect rose. Some days are like that. So how do you read poetry? And I say you attack it. And yes, you need to be aggressive. You need to read it more than one time. Read it out loud. Read the lines as units of thought. Talk back to the poem. Ask questions of it. Pay close attention to how poems start and end. Just like in stories, how stories start and end, poems are pretty much the same way. So we're going to look at one poem, and we're going to go through the process. This is a poem by Stephen Crane. He's the same gentleman that wrote The Open Boat you might have read last week. So you want to ask yourself when the poem was written. So I put a date down, 1895. So that gives you a context that what was going on in the poet's life. Stephen Crane was an interesting gentleman. He has a strong Florida connection. He met the woman that he would fall in love with in Jacksonville, Florida. His family did not approve because she was a madam of a house of ill repute, a house of prostitution. And he lived a very short life. He would die in about 1900, so a few years after this. What was going on in the world? It was shortly after the Spanish-American War, where the United States acquired the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and developed a good, strong relationship with Cuba. Can you understand the poem without the context of it? And I think this poem you can understand without knowing all the things. Other poems that are specific to events, some of Walt Whitman's poems, which are written specifically about Abraham Lincoln, you do need to know something about. But this one you do not. So, talk back to the poem. If I should cast off this tattered coat and go free into the night sky, if I should find nothing there but a vast blue, echoless, ignorant, what then? So ask yourself, does this spring from a historical moment? In this case, no, not particularly. Does this poem speak from a cultural specific culture? Yes, it is very much a Western culture, where we look to the sky and see what might be in it. Does the poem use imagery to achieve a particular effect? Well, we have the image of a tattered coat. If I should cast off this tattered coat. So is he talking about a real coat, or is he talking about something else? We talk about the human body as being our clothing, and that for our soul. And so if we look at this and say, well, the tattered coat is really if I should die. If I should die and go free into the night sky. And so I die and my soul is going someplace. And if when I get there, I find nothing there but a vast blue, there is no God, there is no heaven, there is no hell, it's echoless, ignorant, what do I do? What then? Because I have spent my life preparing to go to heaven. And if there's nothing there, then how do you handle that kind of breach of faith? So you want to ask yourself, who is the speaker of the poem? And so it starts off, if I. So we know that is I, that it is a poet that is speaking it. The circumstances that gave rise to the poem, nothing particular, other than he was in a little bit of ill health at the time. But poets tend to write about dismal things every so often, and you'll find that in some of when we read Emily Dickinson's I Heard a Fly Buzz Next Week. So what is the situation? That he died. And he went somewhere, and there was nothing there. And what is the tone of the poem? Is this a funny poem? Is it a very serious poem? Is it a depressed poem where you want to sit down and say, oh, I'm so sad? Or is it a happy poem? I like the way this ended. And I don't think it's any of those. It's what then it's sort of like a confused. I don't know what to do. It's not sad. It's not angry. It's not happy. It's like, oh, didn't know that was going to happen. So look at what kind of figurative language. Tattered coat and might sky. Notice he used the word might and not night. So might meaning powerful. If the poem is a question, what is the answer? So what do you do if you die and there's not what you expected? Okay, what does the title suggest? In this case, there is no title. Some poems do not have titles, and they're usually known by the first line. This is true of Emily Dickinson, who you will be reading. Ask yourself why certain words are used. Why does he use the word tattered coat? Why does he use the word might sky? Why is it echoless and ignorant? Echoless, because there's nothing to bounce it off. Ignorant, that's an interesting word. What about the punctuation? You got this long dash after ignorant, where the poet wants you to sort of take a long pause before you read the last line. Ask yourself, what form does a poem take? Is it a traditional poem? Is it a sonnet? Does it have couplets? How does the form relate to the content? So this is a more modern poem. If I should cast off this tattered coat and go free into the might sky, if I should find nothing there but a vast blue, echoless, ignorant, what then? So how does the form relate to the content? Because each line brings you on to the next line. And when he gets to the fifth one here with this, he set this up, and then this happens, and now this is where the resolution to the problem is, and there is no resolution. Look at the typography, how the lines are laid out, and this becomes more important when you read some of the later poems that we'll be looking at, and definitely in modern poetry. Look at where the punctuation, the sounds, the rhythms, where you take a breath in reading it, and play with it as you read it. Try taking a breath in different places and see if it changes the meaning. And look at the meter. If I should cast off this tattered coat and go free into the night sky. Okay, so there is not the bounciness of some of the other poems that we have looked at. And finally, you want to ask yourself, how do I feel when I read this poem? Did I look up words I did not know? Did I ask good questions? Did I seek other opinions? And so if you use other sources, which is fine, you don't have to, make sure you document where you got the information from. No copy and pasting is allowed. And then the final evaluation, did you understand the poem? You don't have to understand every poem that you read. You can appreciate it on a number of different levels. So you might like the way it sounds, you might like some of the images in it, but you don't have to like the poems. This class is not about you liking everything that you read. It is about exposing you to what is out there so that you can have some idea of what you may choose. It's sort of like an Oriental buffet. Did you like the poem? And again, you don't have to like the poem, and it's perfectly fine to tell me you didn't like the poem. Did you like parts of the poem? Was parts of it good, some of it not? If you could ask the poet one question, what would it be? Now, remember Stephen Crane is a naturalism? It was in that naturalism school. about fatalism and pessimism. And so this sort of fits in with all of that. Ask him if he was ever happy. So how do you write about poetry? So you go through and you gather the information from your active reading, like we have done. And then what was your evaluation? Did you like it? Didn't you like it? What parts did you like? What didn't you like? Why are you writing about this poem? Why did you pick this poem to write about? Formulate questions you would like to answer, and then find some answers to them. Now, there are 4 ways that you can approach this. You can look at the poem and look at the author's life and how it influenced the writing. So you could take the Stephen Crane and look at his life and say, oh, that's why he wrote it. He was just really depressed most of his life. You can use a textual approach. How was his structure, the word choices, and things like that. You can use a cultural approach, society and the works, themes, social and philosophical issues. And you can use a personal approach. What did you think of it? So you need to stay focused in what you're doing. So develop a research question. Why do I like this poem? Why don't I like this poem? Answer the question. This is the most important part of the paper. A thesis, a single statement that sort of says what you think. Do an outline. This will help you stay focused. Find credible sources that can relate to what you're doing. Copy and paraphrase sources accurately. But your paper should not be nothing but copy and paste. You need to talk about it. I want your thoughts on it. I can read other people's things. I want yours. Use the writing process. Organize yourself. Write. Then go back and edit it. Make sure that you've gotten rid of any silly mistakes. So, to summarize, poetry is an ancient art form. It's been around for untold thousands of years. The structure is usually in lines and stanzas. Meters is how syllables are accented. Sound is emphasized through rhyme, alliteration, and assonance. Imagery is used to replace concepts. Read poetry carefully for several meanings. Write from your perspective. And lastly, I want you to sort of sit back and enjoy it. Some resources that you can use, that I have used. So if you have any questions, please let me know.